The rope had whispered its secrets to the bark long before Isaac Woodard found what was left of his brother. In the bruised pre-dawn light of a Georgia pine grove in 1866, the story was etched into the timber itself. Deep, jagged grooves spoke of Samuel's final, desperate struggle, fingernails clawing at the rough skin of the tree while the hemp hauled him toward a sky that offered no mercy. Beneath the branch, the evidence of a coward's ritual lay scattered like autumn debris, shreds of white fabric, a torn hood discarded in haste, and heavy boot prints pressing east toward the town. Samuel had been 23 years old, a man who had tasted 18 months of a fragile technical freedom and spent every waking hour of it at the missionary school trying to wrap his mind around the power of the written word. His crime was a lack of submission. He had walked past a white woman on the boardwalk without descending into the mud to clear her path. Isaac's hands, usually steady as stone, did not shake as he reached up to cut the weight of his kin down. He had done his shaking in the long, suffocating hours of the night, carrying Samuel's cooling body through woods that seemed to hum with the low, distant laughter of men who believed they had finished a chore. Now, kneeling in the dirt to dig a shallow, lonely grave, Isaac worked with the cold, surgical precision of a man who was no longer burying a brother, but interring the very idea that freedom meant safety. The dirt of Miller County was red and unforgiving, a perfect mirror for the grief Isaac was currently packing into the earth. He dug alone because in 1866, the act of helping a black man bury a victim of the correction was a death sentence in its own right. As he smoothed the soil over Samuel's chest, he felt a part of himself hardening, transforming into something as sharp and unyielding as the Bowie knife at his hip. This wasn't just a burial, it was an activation. Isaac Woodard was a man of specific lethal talents, and those talents were about to be turned inward upon the geography that had swallowed his brother. But before we get into the details of how this hunt unfolded, I want to pause and ask, where are you watching this from right now? What time is it in your corner of the world? Drop a comment below and let me know. It's important to see how far these stories travel. And if you believe that some accounts shouldn't stay buried in the dust of history, hit that like button and subscribe. What follows isn't just a tale of revenge, it's a breakdown of a military campaign fought in the shadows of the American South. A story that stayed hidden in county records for a century and a half because the truth was darker than the men in hoods ever anticipated. Miller County was a stretch of clay roads and cotton fields, where Reconstruction was a word used by politicians in Washington, but fear was the only language spoken on the ground. The local power structure was 27 members strong, a chapter of the invisible empire that met every Tuesday at midnight in the shell of a burned-out Baptist church on the town's periphery. Their horses would be tied in the thickets, breathing hard, while the men inside planned which freedmen needed reminding of their place. The architect of this order was Sheriff Clayton Deer, a man who functioned more like an accountant than a lawman. He kept a meticulous ledger, but it wasn't a record of crimes. It was a tracking of debts. Every black family that attempted to purchase an acre of land, every school that dared to open its doors, and every man like Samuel who stood too tall on a boardwalk was noted in Deer's ledger, with the chilling care of a man tracking inventory. Deer believed that control came from information and that order was maintained through the strategic application of terror. He viewed Samuel's lynching as a necessary line item, a public demonstration intended to keep the peace by shattering the spirit of the freedmen's quarter. He had no way of knowing that one of those line items had a brother who had spent the war learning how to dismantle empires from the inside. Isaac Woodard had been a scout for the Union Army, specifically the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. He was a man trained to move through hostile territory without leaving a trace or a sound. During the war, he had mapped Confederate supply lines, identified high-value targets, and vanished into the marsh before the first light of dawn. Those skills, the patience, the engineering, the ability to calculate trajectories and identify structural weak points, hadn't faded with the surrender at Appomattox. If anything, they had sharpened in the furnace of his loss. Isaac began to view Miller County not as a home, but as an enemy theater. He mapped the movements of the 27 Klansmen with the same clinical detachment he'd used against Confederate generals. He noted who drank too much at the general store, who took the unlit shortcuts through the alleys, and who among them carried the heaviest burden of guilt. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was planning a liquidation. He understood that the clan's power rested on their perceived invincibility, the idea that they were a force of nature rather than a collection of men. To break them, he wouldn't just need to kill them. He would need to make them feel the very isolation and helplessness they had inflicted on Samuel. The first strike happened 3 weeks after the funeral, and it was designed to look like the hand of God or the clumsiness of a drunkard. Thomas Pritchard was a millman who had spent the days following the lynching, boasting to anyone who would listen about how he'd helped haul the rope. He was found at the bottom of his own well on a Tuesday morning with a shattered neck. The town officials called it a tragic accident, a man who'd had too much corn whiskey and slipped on the mossy stones in the dark. It was a clean explanation, one that allowed the town to keep its head down. However, the message meant for the inner circle arrived at midnight. Someone had taken a white hood, Pritchard's own hood, and nailed it to his front door. There was no note, no signature, and no explanation required. The symbolism was a physical punch to the gut of the chapter. It suggested that their secrets weren't secret and their homes weren't fortresses. Isaac had watched from the tree line as the news spread, his face a mask of charcoal and shadow. He had watched the way Sheriff Deer's hand had twitched toward his holster when he saw the hood. The count had begun. 26 remained. The clan held an emergency meeting that Thursday, the air thick with the scent of tobacco and burgeoning panic. They spoke of union agitators, of carpetbagger revenge, and of federal conspiracies. They looked everywhere except at the possibility that the people they terrorized were capable of fighting back. To admit that a freed slave could execute a military-grade assassination was to admit that their entire racial hierarchy was a lie, and that was a reality they couldn't afford to inhabit. Sheriff Deer tried to steady them, tapping his ledger and speaking of lawless elements, but even his voice lacked its usual bureaucratic steel. From Deer's private journal, an entry dated October 8, 1866, noted, "Pritchard incident unsettles the men. Some talk of federal troops. None suspect the truth." Isaac, perched in the rafters of a nearby barn, heard the tremor in their voices. He knew that fear was a weapon sharper than any Bowie blade, and he was just beginning to unsheath it. He had the patience of a hunter and the training of a soldier, and Miller County was about to learn that the silence of the night didn't mean they were alone. It meant the predator had finally found his rhythm. The second death arrived with a speed that suggested the predator wasn't just efficient, but accelerating. Martin Hayes was a man of the earth, a hunter who prided himself on his ability to track a deer through the thickest briars of the river bottoms. He was also the man who had held the torch high during Samuel's lynching, his face illuminated by the orange glow of a fire that consumed more than just wood. It consumed his humanity. On a humid October afternoon, Hayes went out looking for game and simply failed to return. They found him 4 days later in a place he knew better than his own backyard. He was slumped against a cypress knee, his rifle unfired and leaning neatly beside him, his eyes wide with a final, frozen realization. His throat had been opened with what the local coroner, a man who had seen his share of war wounds, called military precision. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken branches, and no muddy footprints. It was as if the forest itself had reached out and silenced him. For the first time, the men of Miller County began to look at the woods not as a resource, but as a witness. The silence of the bottoms became heavy, pregnant with the weight of a debt that was being collected in blood. The local gossip shifted from boasting to hushed whispers, and the certainty that had once armored the clan began to show its first hairline fractures. The psychological warfare intensified that following Sunday. While the town gathered for service, a fresh white hood appeared, not on a private door, but pinned directly to the heavy oak doors of the burned-out church where the clan held its secret councils. The fabric was stained. Some said with mud from the river, others whispered it was something darker, and it was pinned with a note written in a hand that was hauntingly careful. It didn't contain a manifesto or a threat. It simply bore 2 words, 25 remain. The choice of stationery was a deliberate jab at the men who had killed Samuel for the crime of literacy. It told them that their victim's legacy was alive and that his education was now being used to count their graves. Isaac Woodard watched the discovery from the shadows of a livery stable, his expression unreadable behind a veil of digital charcoal shadow. He was applying the lessons of the 54th Massachusetts with a cold, focused fury. He mapped their fear the way he'd once mapped enemy supply lines, identifying the weak points in their routines and calculating the trajectories of their panic. He knew that a frightened man makes mistakes, and a man who believes he is being hunted by a ghost will eventually provide his own throat to the blade. The third killing was the one that finally broke the chapter's remaining confidence. Robert Finch was a tobacco farmer who had laughed the loudest while Samuel swung, a man whose cruelty was as much a part of him as the soil under his fingernails. He was discovered in his own barn, pinned to the wooden wall by his own pitchfork. The weapon had been driven through his chest with such immense, focused force that the tines had buried themselves deep into the oak siding. But it was the staging that turned the town's blood to ice. Finch's Klan robe had been draped across a nearby stall, stuffed with straw and arranged like a headless scarecrow, positioned so that it appeared to be watching the corpse. It was a grotesque parody of their own rituals, a mirror held up to their madness. This time, the reaction wasn't just whispers, it was flight. 3 families packed their wagons and left Miller County before the sun had fully set, citing urgent business elsewhere. When the Klan met that Tuesday, the attendance had plummeted. Only 19 men showed up, and they sat in a circle with their rifles across their laps, looking at each other with eyes that were rimmed with red from lack of sleep. The hunters were finally beginning to understand the visceral, suffocating weight of being the prey. I want to stop here for a second and ask you something. Standing at a site like that, knowing the man you're looking at was the one who orchestrated your brother's murder, what would you feel? Would it be the cold satisfaction of justice, or would you feel the weight of the dirt getting under your own fingernails? Is there a point where the cost of revenge becomes too high for the soul to pay? Let me know in the comments, because this is where the psychology of Isaac Woodard gets complicated. If stories that explore the thin line between justice and darkness pull you in, make sure you've hit that subscribe button. What happened next in Miller County changed the geography of fear in Georgia forever. The remaining Klansmen were no longer acting like a secret society. They were acting like a cornered animal. Sheriff Deere, sensing the disintegration of his order, attempted to lock the town down, but Isaac was already moving through the spaces between the sheriff's meticulous records. He was teaching them that silence cuts deeper than any scream, and that a man who has lost everything is the most dangerous architect in the world. The 4th death proved that no walls could keep the accountant out. William Cobb was the youngest of the chapter, barely 21, a boy who had joined the Klan for the same reason boys join gangs today, for a sense of belonging and power. He died in his own home, in the room next to where his parents slept. They found him at the breakfast table, his throat opened, and a white hood placed over his head like a burial shroud. Isaac had watched Cobb for 3 nights. Noting a tiny, insignificant vulnerability, the boy left the window unlatched to let in the cool night air. That small habit was all the scout needed. He had entered and exited without waking a single soul, a ghost in the hallway, a shadow in the kitchen. When the news hit the town square, the count was down to 6. The mathematics were no longer abstract. They were a countdown to an inevitable 0. Sheriff Deere called an emergency meeting in his locked office above the jail, his hand twitching toward the whiskey drawer. He looked at the faces of his remaining men, pale, jumping at the sound of footfalls, and utterly exhausted. He realized he was seeing something he'd never witnessed in 4 years of war, the absolute collapse of the Southern certainty. "We need federal troops," someone suggested, their voice cracking. "This is terrorism. We have to wire the district commander." Deere's response was a low-level growl that silenced the room. "And tell them what? That someone is killing Klan members. They'd send investigators, not protectors. They'd start asking for membership lists and searching for connections between us and every lynching from the last 2 years. We'd hang from federal rope just as surely as we're being hunted now." The room went silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock. Deere tapped the ledger on his desk, the book that had once been his Bible of control. "We set a trap," he said, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't random. The killer knows our habits. He knows who was there that night. Next Tuesday, we announce a meeting at the old church. We make it loud, make sure word spreads. But we don't gather there. We gather 2 miles north in the tobacco barn, armed and waiting. When our killer arrives at the church to find us, he'll find nothing but a decoy, and we'll be behind him. It was a solid plan, built on the logic of a man who understood bait. It would have worked too if Isaac hadn't been listening to every single word through the floor vent. He was crouched in the absolute darkness of the jail cell directly below Deer's office, having picked the lock an hour before the men arrived. He sat there, his breathing synchronized with the ticking of the clock above, a shadow within a shadow. He heard the names, the locations, and the timing. He heard the fear in their voices disguised as strategy. As the men filed out of the office, Isaac didn't move. He waited until the building was silent, until the only sound was the wind whistling through the iron bars of the cell. He had 6 Klansmen left and 1 sheriff, 7 more lessons to teach. The trap was set, but it wasn't the one Deer had envisioned. Isaac closed his eyes, visualizing the tobacco barn, calculating the soil density, and planning the engineering of a grave that would hold more than just one man. The mathematics of revenge were moving into their final, most lethal phase, and the night was just beginning to breathe. The autumn wind carried the heavy, cloying scent of curing tobacco and kerosene through the gaps in the barn's weathered plank walls. It was 10:45 p.m. on Tuesday, November 20th, 1866, and inside the structure the air was thick with the nervous sweat of 6 men who had spent their lives making others tremble. Sheriff Deer had chosen this location with a soldier's eye. The barn was surrounded by open fields that offered zero cover for an approaching enemy, providing sightlines that covered every possible angle. The Klansmen were positioned like snipers, some in the loft, others behind stacked crates, rifles loaded and hammers cocked. They were waiting for a phantom. They believed their decoy at the old Baptist church would draw the killer out, leaving him exposed in the town square while they sat here, the true hunters in the dark. Deer checked his pocket watch by the shielded glow of a single candle, his face a landscape of hard lines and desperate resolve. Martin Pierce stood at the north window, his hands finally steady now that he held a weapon. They were prepared for a siege, prepared for a frontal assault from the roads or the tree lines. What they didn't know was that the geography of the fight had already shifted beneath their boots. Isaac Woodard wasn't approaching the barn, he was already part of its foundation. The crawl space beneath the tobacco barn was a suffocating tomb of dried leaf chaff and rat droppings, offering barely 2 feet of clearance. Isaac had squeezed into this darkness 3 hours before sunset, long before Deer's men had arrived to set their trap. He lay motionless, his breathing so shallow it wouldn't have stirred a cobweb, listening to the creak of the floorboards as the men shifted their weight above him. He navigated the space by memory and touch, having scouted the barn's underside days prior. He had brought 4 things into that hole: a Bowie knife, a coil of hemp rope, a tin of kerosene, and the absolute patience he had mastered during 18 months of scouting for the 54th Massachusetts. Through the narrow gaps in the floorboards, he could see fragments of his targets: the heel of a boot, the glint of a lantern, the edge of a rifle barrel. He wasn't just waiting for the right moment, he was waiting for the moment when their confidence reached its peak, just before the first cracks of doubt began to rot their resolve. At 11:00 p.m. sharp, a horse and rider appeared on the road south of the church. This was Moses Carter, a man who had seen 70 years of Southern justice and had agreed to play his part for $5 and the chance to see the hierarchy stumble. As Moses rode past the decoy site, the Klansmen in the barn tensed, their fingers tightening on triggers. They waited for the sounds of a struggle, for the signal from their lookouts, but the night remained stubbornly, terrifyingly quiet. Half an hour passed, then 45 minutes. Doubt began to spread through the barn like a slow-acting poison. "Maybe he's not coming," Tucker whispered from the loft, his voice barely audible over the wind. "He'll come," Deer replied, though the iron in his tone was starting to rust. Isaac, lying directly beneath Martin Pierce's boots, knew that frightened men developed patterns even when they thought they were being random. He watched Pierce's weight shift from his left foot to his right, a rhythmic tick of anxiety that told Isaac exactly where the man's center of gravity lay. The stage was set for a performance they hadn't rehearsed. Isaac began to move with the silence of a ghost. He pressed the 13-inch carbon steel of his Bowie blade upward through a gap in the floorboards, working the wood like a lever, widening the seam directly beneath Pierce. The rope came next, threaded through the gap and fashioned into a noose. Pierce never looked down. Why would he? Danger was supposed to come from the horizon, from the others outside. The idea that death could rise from the very earth they stood upon never occurred to men who had built their lives on the backs of the oppressed. At 12:15 a.m., Isaac yanked. The rope snapped tight around Pierce's ankle, and the man had half a second of pure, unadulterated confusion before he was pulled off balance. The floorboards, which Isaac had weakened the night before, exploded in a shower of splinters. Pierce fell into the crawl space with a choked scream that was cut short by the precision of a knife finding its mark. Above, chaos erupted. "He's in the floor!" someone shrieked, and the barn was suddenly illuminated by the strobe light flashes of rifle fire as the men blind fired into the dirt beneath them. Wood chips and splinters rained down as the remaining Klansmen emptied their weapons into the darkness, hitting nothing but the red Georgia clay and their own panic. Isaac had already rolled away from Pierce's body, moving toward the southwest corner where he had partially sawed through the main support beam. He kicked it once, hard, and the structure groaned as the roof sagged. Monroe, stationed in the loft, felt the world tilt. His weight was the final straw. The northwest section of the roof came down in a thunderous crash of shingles and heavy timber, pinning him beneath the wreckage. Before anyone could move to help, the kerosene tin Isaac had planted near the lantern tipped. The fuel met the open flame, and the dry tobacco leaves ignited with a roar. The barn became an oven in seconds, the fire feeding on the very crop that had funded the Klan's power. "Out! Everyone out!" Deere commanded, his voice barely rising above the crackle of the flames. They scrambled for the doors, their trap having transformed into a funeral pyre. Henderson was the first to burst into the night air, coughing and disoriented by the sudden transition from smoke to cold. He didn't see Isaac rise from the exterior vent behind him. He didn't feel the rope until it was already looped around his neck. Isaac hauled him backward into the tall grass with the clinical efficiency of a stage hook, silencing him before his feet could even kick. By the time Davis and Tucker emerged, Henderson had vanished into the shadows. The two men stood in the flickering light of the burning barn, rifles raised, scanning a landscape that now seemed to breathe with hostility. They were learning what it felt like to be the hunted, to know that every shadow held a promise and every silence was a threat. Isaac watched them from the darkness, his breathing steady, his mind already calculating the next move. What would you do in this moment? If you were standing in that field, watching the symbols of your oppression go up in smoke, would you stop at 1, or would you see the count through to 0? Drop a comment below. I want to know where your line is. The mathematics of revenge were becoming undeniable. 4 Klansmen and 1 sheriff remained, standing in the orange glow of a dying order. Deere finally understood the reality of his situation. This wasn't a lawless riot or a federal raid. This was a military strategy executed by a man who had turned their own tactics against them. He looked at the smoking ruins of the barn and realized that Isaac Woodard wasn't just killing men. He was dismantling the myth of their invincibility. As Tucker's head snapped sideways, a rope appearing from the darkness to yank him into the void, Davis fired blindly into the trees, a useless gesture of defiance. Isaac stepped from behind a sprawling oak and ended Davis's fear with a single, silent thrust. Now, only 2 remained in the firelight, Sheriff Clayton Deere and Isaac Woodard. The hunter and the hunted were finally face to face, but the roles had been permanently reversed. The count was nearly finished, and the most difficult lesson was yet to be taught. The bonfire cast dancing, elongated shadows across Clayton Deere's face, illuminating the features of a man who had spent a decade sentencing others without a trial. Isaac Woodard stepped into the flickering light's edge, 50 feet away, the Bowie knife still dark with the evidence of his work. He had removed his hat, letting Deere see him fully, not as a faceless phantom or a Union ghost, but as the man whose brother had been murdered for the crime of dignity. Recognition hit the sheriff like a bucket of ice water. He stared at the man he had once watched with casual contempt from his office window. "You," Deere breathed, his rifle raised and aimed at Isaac's center mass, though his hands had developed a tremor that made the barrel waver in the humid air. "You're just one man." Isaac didn't flinch. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, the tone of a person discussing the weather. "One man with a brother," Isaac interrupted. "Samuel Woodard, 23 years old. You wrote his name in your ledger under disciplinary actions required on August 15th. I found the entry, Clayton. I read the debt you thought you'd never have to pay. The sheriff's finger tightened on the trigger, but a primal fear kept him from firing. There was a terrifying certainty in Isaac's posture, a stillness that suggested bullets were merely theoretical concerns. You can't prove anything, Deere stammered, falling back on the authority of a system that was currently burning behind him. I'm a lawful sheriff. You're a murderer. Even if you kill me, there are federal troops, marshals, and courts. Isaac took a slow, deliberate step forward. Courts that wouldn't let my brother testify, marshals who looked away while you burned the books he died to read. You built a system where we had no voice and no protection. Now you complain that I'm not using legal channels. He closed the distance, his eyes locked on Deere's. Before we see how this confrontation ends, I have to ask, what would you do? Standing in that ash, would you feel the weight of justice or just the weight of the steel in your hand? Drop a comment below. Does mercy have a place in a world that shows none? And if you're finding the truth of this history as gripping as I am, make sure you've hit that like button. Instead of finishing it there, Isaac hauled the sheriff to his feet, keeping the knife at his throat. Walk, he commanded, directing Deere toward the old Baptist church, the place where the Klan had celebrated their correction of Samuel. Inside, Isaac had prepared the sanctuary with a chilling attention to detail. 7 white hoods were arranged in a semicircle around the altar, each stained with ash from the tobacco barn. In the center, a noose hung from a ceiling beam, the very rope Isaac had cut down from the pine grove months ago. Deere saw the setup and collapsed into a plea. No, please, I have a family, children. Isaac's face remained a mask of stone. Samuel had a family too. He had me. He forced Deere up the steps and into the noose's shadow. He had calculated the drop, the knot placement, the physics of a clean break. He had become an expert in the mechanics of death. But as he looked at the shivering man before him, a realization took hold. Killing Deere here like this would make him the monster the Klan claimed he was. Samuel, who believed education proved their humanity, deserved a legacy better than a mirror image of his killer's brutality. Isaac lowered the knife. I should kill you. But Samuel believed in something better than us. He released Deere, stepping back into the shadows of the pews. Here's what happens instead. You're going to gather the ones who ran, the ones hiding, and you're going to tell them the Klan is finished in Miller County. No more burnings, no more lynchings, because if I hear about one schoolhouse touched, I won't stop at 7 next time. Deere stared, unable to process the pivot. You're letting me go, Isaac corrected him with a voice like iron. I'm giving you a choice. Live with the knowledge that a man you called property spared your life. See if your children think you were right. But Isaac had made a critical miscalculation. He had assumed that a man like Deere could feel shame. To men built on a hierarchy of violence, mercy is not a gift. It is a humiliation that demands a bloody response. The moment Isaac turned to leave, Deere grabbed a fallen rifle from the corner and fired. The shot echoed through the church like a final amen, and Isaac Woodard dropped, blood spreading from his left shoulder. The second shot missed, punching through the church wall as Isaac rolled behind a heavy oak pew for cover. Blood left a trail across the floorboards like a fresh accusation. You should have killed me, Deere shouted, his voice gaining its cruel edge back. That was your mistake, thinking mercy meant anything to men like me. Your brother was a fool, and you're a dead man. Isaac pressed against the wood, breathing through gritted teeth, his left arm hanging useless. He realized then that the better world Samuel imagined wasn't ready to be born yet. He reached for the revolver he had taken from a fallen Klansman, his vision blurring from the sudden shock of the wound. He called out a bluff, telling Deere he had copied the ledger and sent it to the district marshal in Atlanta. The hesitation that followed bought Isaac enough time to roll and fire. He didn't aim for the heart, he aimed for the legs. The second shot caught Deere in the thigh, dropping the sheriff as his rifle clattered away, the church filled with the copper smell of blood and the acrid sting of gunpowder. Before the violence could cycle again, the church door burst open. Moses Carter stood silhouetted against the night, a shotgun braced against his shoulder. Don't, Moses said, his weapon aimed at the center of the room. Not like this, Isaac. That's not justice. That's just us becoming them. The weight of the intervention was heavy. Moses was 73, a man who had survived decades of bondage and knew that an execution in a church would only give the clan a martyr. As they stood in the stalemate, the thunder of multiple horses approached, not vigilantes, but federal authority arriving far too late. Marshal Calhoun and a column of Union cavalry burst in, finding a tableau that would define the coming trial. 2 wounded men, a floor stained with blood, and the physical evidence of the clan's robes scattered like ghosts. "Explain this," Calhoun demanded. Deer tried to spin the lie immediately, claiming Isaac was a murderer who had ambushed him. But Moses, the man who had seen everything, stood firm. "That's not how it happened," he said. "The sheriff was about to execute an unarmed man, and we have the ledger to prove why." The trial in Atlanta in January 1867 was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering and historical disappointment. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and tobacco, but the air was freezing. Isaac sat in the witness chair, his shoulders stiff, facing a jury of 12 white men who looked at him with a suspicion that bordered on hatred. The prosecutor, Abernathy, tried to use Deer's ledger, but the judge, a former Confederate prosecutor, ruled it inadmissible as private property seized without a warrant. The defense, led by a lawyer named Crenshaw, didn't defend Deer's character. He attacked Isaac's. He painted the Union scout as a military assassin who had returned home to hunt innocent citizens. He turned Isaac's service into a weapon against him. "You expect this court to believe," Crenshaw sneered, "that 7 men died by coincidence while you, a trained killer, were in town." Isaac's testimony about Samuel's murder was dismissed as circumstantial. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes. Not guilty on all charges, the verdict was a promise to the South. The law would remain a shield for the powerful and a cage for the freedmen. The train south rattled through the skeletal cold of February, the iron wheels screaming against the tracks as Isaac Woodard retreated from the hollow theater of Atlanta's justice. He had done everything the system demanded. He had survived the hunt, documented the atrocities, and stood before a federal court to speak the truth until his voice was raw. But as the Georgia landscape blurred into a gray smear of dormant cotton fields and naked pines, the weight of the not guilty verdict sat in his stomach like lead. He had learned a bitter truth that the 54th Massachusetts hadn't taught him. The law was not a shield for the righteous. It was a cage that could be opened or locked at the whim of the jailer. Isaac was returning to Miller County not as a victor, but as a man marked for death. The federal cavalry was already withdrawing, leaving a power vacuum that Sheriff Clayton Deer was already filling with the familiar machinery of terror. The trial hadn't broken the Klan. It had merely taught them how to better hide their ledgers. Miller County in late winter felt like a breath held too long. The town square was unnervingly quiet, the storefronts casting long, jagged shadows across the clay roads. Isaac walked toward the freedmen's quarter, aware of the eyes tracking his every movement from behind curtains and porch rails. The accountant was back, but his ledger had been ruled inadmissible, and his brother's killers were back in their saddles, wearing their badges with a newfound arrogance. Isaac went straight to Moses Carter's cabin, a structure that seemed to lean more heavily toward the earth with every passing season. Ruth met him at the door, her eyes rimmed with the red fatigue of a woman who had spent her life mourning men who dared to be more than shadows. "He's fading, Isaac," she whispered. Moses lay on a thin cot near the hearth, his body reduced to a topography of bone and scar tissue. The man who had seen 70 years of Southern order was finally surrendering to the only authority that couldn't be bribed: time. "I heard the news from Atlanta," Moses rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Don't look so surprised, son. Men like Deer don't build systems that can hang them. They build systems that hang us." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that shook his fragile frame. "But you need to listen. Deer isn't just angry, he's calculating. My daughter heard it from the housemaid who cleans his office. He's organizing what he calls a correction, a coordinated strike against every man who testified, every family who helped you, and everyone who made him look weak in front of the marshals. He's learned from you, Isaac. He's not going to hunt you alone. He's going to burn the whole quarter to find you." The warning was a cold splash of reality. Isaac had won the tactical battle in the tobacco barn, but he was losing the strategic war. Revenge, he realized, had a diminishing return. For every Klansman he struck down, the system produced 3 more, fueled by the humiliation of having been made to feel afraid. Isaac sat with Moses until the old man's breathing simply ceased, a quiet exit that felt profoundly unfair given the violence of the world he was leaving behind. They buried him in the rocky soil of the Freedmen's Cemetery, a brief ceremony conducted under the watchful, mocking eye of Clayton Deer, who sat his horse on the distant road. The sheriff didn't need to say a word. His presence was a promise. That night, Isaac sat in the darkness of the cabin with Ruth and the remnants of their community. "We can't win this by killing them," Ruth said, her voice steady despite the terror. "There are too many, and they own the ground we stand on. What you did, it felt like justice for a moment. But a justice that requires a Union army to stay forever isn't justice at all. It's just a temporary reprieve." Isaac looked at the Bowie knife on the table, the tool of his vengeance, and saw it for what it was, a dead end. To save the people Samuel had loved, Isaac would have to do the one thing his warrior's heart loathed. He would have to leave the field. Isaac Woodard vanished from Georgia on February 14, 1867. He took a train north, carrying nothing but a small bag, his brother's memory, and the hard-won wisdom that survival was a form of resistance. He arrived in Chicago as a different man, adopting the name Samuel Carter, a fusion of the brother he'd buried and the mentor who'd saved him. The city was a sprawling industrial labyrinth of stockyards and coal smoke, a place where a man could disappear into the labor force and never be found by the ghosts of Miller County. Isaac spent 46 years in the industrial sector, working the meatpacking plants and the loading docks. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, disciplined man who kept to himself. But in the shadows of the South Side, Isaac ran a secret school. It wasn't a school for reading and writing, though he encouraged both. It was a school for strategic survival. He taught young men fleeing the Jim Crow South how to recognize the patterns of institutionalized violence, how to document evidence when the law wouldn't, and how to protect a community when the police were the predators. He taught them that power respected force, but that force without organization was just a suicide mission. He shared the lessons of the 54th Massachusetts and the tactical failures of the tobacco barn. "Revenge is for the individual," he would tell them, his eyes reflecting the digital charcoal shadows of a long-ago pine grove. "But protection is for the people. You don't fight to get even. You fight to stay standing." His students grew up to become the lawyers who challenged the systems that had acquitted Deer. They became the activists who organized the first self-defense leagues in Chicago, and the scouts who mapped the new battlefields of the 20th century. Isaac never returned to Georgia, but his legacy flowed back south through the veins of the civil rights movement. The nonviolent resistance of the 1960s wasn't just about moral superiority. It was a sophisticated application of the very strategic patience Isaac had mastered, a way to force the system to reveal its own rot while remaining untouchable. Isaac Woodard died in 1913, outliving Clayton Deer by decades. He died under a false name, but with a true soul. He had learned that the bravest thing a man could do wasn't always to swing the knife. Sometimes it was to survive long enough to teach the next generation how to dismantle the hierarchy entirely. In the end, the Klan in Miller County didn't fall because of a single man's vengeance. It fell because the fear they traded in eventually lost its value. The moment someone like Isaac fights back, even if he loses the trial, even if he has to run, the math changes forever. Fear starts to flow in both directions, and a power built on fear alone is a house built on sand. Today, the bloodstains in that old church are gone, but the story remains. It's a story about the long, slow arc of justice and the men who are willing to walk that path, one calculated step at a time. Thank you for walking through this dark chapter of history with me. These stories aren't just about the past. They are blueprints for understanding the psychology of power and resistance. If this 5-part journey moved you, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. We have more deep dives into the hidden corridors of historical storytelling coming soon.